We're going to be freshening up the meaning of the word extemporaneous today as we approach the topic of balance of interests in our standard system, and why an understanding of it can help our industry make campuses safer, simpler, lower cost, and longer lasting. We treated the topic of balance of interest tangentially in previous weekly discussions, but as I began to research it more carefully for specific treatment, I began to see why there's not a lot of literature on the subject. Now, of course, there's a working understanding of what a balanced market of stakeholders mean for our colleagues at the American National Standards Institute in Washington and also their counterparts in Geneva and other nations. And it's enough to get the work done. But so much what constitutes balance depends upon the type of technology, the character of the industry, that this attempt only qualifies as a fast first draft, and you'll probably see why. It's very difficult to put in English what a balanced market really is. In general, I like to think of the differences between markets as the difference between how price signals move, how quickly they move. In consumer products, obviously, we see fast-moving price signals. The amount of money is generally not very large, so they move fast. Take the iPhone, for example, or a piece of gum. We know very quickly what the price is. In infrastructure markets, signals are very slow, they're very large, and balance is very hard to come by, and that's part of the thesis of what we've been trying to get across here. So for the moment, what you should be seeing on the screen is a video webcam of Michigan State University. This is kind of our custom. We like to see what's going on around the country. I have on the call with me my colleague, my man in LA, so to say, Mike Toner. He is helping me do a better job preparing these video clips, and I thought I'd give you a look at what things look like in Southern California at the moment. This is what it looked like about a minute or so ago. So Mike claims that this is his weather. Is that close to accurate, Mike?
I would say that's fairly accurate looking outside right now.
Yeah, very nice. So in any case, let's get started with this. I know it's a holiday for many. One of the arguments that I've made over the years is that we know that the education facilities industry, despite its size as a whole, its $300 billion footprint, we are very mindful that we are just a support service to the primary academic and the education research mission. I put brand identity enterprises in here because whether we like it or not, the athletic programs and what the meaning of what a state university system is in individual states, typically it's one of the largest investments any state has. So I put together athletic enterprises, the opportunities that state universities present to individual state population. I sort of put that together in brand identity. We know that in our federalist system, states are competing with one another in a healthy way, of course, and so that's what I put when I say brand identity enterprises. Very often people rally around a sports team, but it can be other aspects of what their state university systems or even their private university system delivers. Of course, there's the academic mission and then there's the business mission. The business mission, again, is the support for the academic mission. But very often we're finding that they will converge and diverge. Certain assumptions about climate change is one that rallies the academic mission, but very often it has to be moderated by the business mission. And so when you add in the university-affiliated medical research and clinical delivery enterprises, again, part of the brand of the state, that adds another dimension of complexity. So when we're seeking balance, we have to understand that even within our own industry, there are these cross-currents and different interests. It's an industry is that large, one would expect that there would be different interests. But this is the large one, the academic mission versus the business mission. And I think all college presidents struggle with that. Especially when you bring in the athletic department and all that other. So, of course, now when you drill down into the business mission, what you'll see here is that there's a further divergence, and I broadly call it the user enforcer and the user owner. Now, what the user is something we'll get into a little bit more farther in this discussion, but the user enforcer is one that thinks of their primary role as making sure that the facilities are safe. Usually that's the fire marshal, the occupational health organizations. But of course, there's other parts of the system of a university or college where you're actually running the facilities and you're the owner of facilities. For example, a department, an individual department like the law department or the history department or the mathematics department. You're thinking of the economy of running your own facility square footage, and very often there is a competing interest, or at least one that trying to moderate and make sure that your facilities are safe. Of course, in the long run, the user owner is also interested in safe facilities. So that's the two large ones. Now, let's stand back a little bit and look at what the American National Standards Institute and the way they describe the general interest users and producers. Generally, and these are the rather broad categories, and as you'll see, they have to be broken up just as I broke them up for our industry. You'll see that this category or this categorization of interest seems to have worked well. When I talk to my colleagues at ANSI, they're saying, this is a very old document, likely as old as ANSI itself. This has withstood the test of time. So this is, I would call, canons. Just as we have canons such as safer, simpler, lower cost, and longer lasting, this is ANSI's canon. This is derived from their founding document, or at least their core document, the essential requirements. And their recognition, however, that the user interest is a bit more complicated is this paragraph that I've taken from the essential requirements for due process. And you can see that they have broken it down a little bit here: consumer, industrial, government, and labor. And when we go back and we look at what I've done with the diagram that applies to this, you'll begin to see how I've tried to balance these interest categories, but it's very difficult to describe. There's a sense of what it is. You certainly can sense imbalance, but what exactly is balance is a little bit more difficult to discern. And of course, one way of describing perfect balance or a perfect market is one where everyone is equally unhappy. We try this. I assume everybody is happy with how everybody else is equally unhappy, and that's what we're seeking. Any questions? Okay, since Jack is unable, he doesn't have a microphone, so he's not able to ask questions here. Let's get into, I'm going to go back a little bit here, and let's just see what I've tried to create here. It's one, this is, I'll just say the infrastructure space right here. And I've used kind of a canned format that Prezi gives me to try to describe how all these categories line up and how they oppose and balance each other and how they complement each other. So I'm going to go to what we're all familiar with, of course, is the enforcement interest. The fire marshal, the building inspector, very often that enterprise is within a university, especially a large university like ours. But if you look at another large university, Harvard University was an example where they routinely use the City of Cambridge inspections departments. Smaller universities, colleges, K-12 will often have to defer to the judgment and skill and final rulings of the fire marshal, building inspector. But there is a practical reality, especially in larger universities, where the insurance companies, and I'm thinking of FM Global, for example, who's our carrier, but it could just as easily be a Aetna or another organization that has the practical effect of being enforcement, meaning that you can go ahead and do what you want, but if we can't insure it, you're on your own. Of course, now another part of all that is what will be called the product or laboratory conformity interest. That again, when you want your products to be assured that they're safe, you want to make sure that they can be traded across global borders. You want to be able to make sure that the products conform to a certain standard. So you can imagine the difficulty we've had over the past several years with people buying their drugs overseas or through the mail, and there's not product conformity there, and you'll find that people are taking their medications, and those medications are counterfeit. So I could have used a stronger word here called counterfeiting, but that's probably another discussion. So that's what we'll call enforcement. Now on the other side, we have us, those in service of the individual departments, the square footage of individual departments, the energy and the communication systems between those square footages, very often in separate buildings. The user could be an instructor. Now I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, and this is another example of how it's difficult to explain how all this fits together, but when you have a document Very often that document is complicated, and the person who is actually trying to teach that document is thought to be a user. In many documents, in many of the transactions and transcripts of how standards are developed, you'll see that instructors do have a voice. They'll say, is this good code, for example? And then another question would be, how can I teach this? And of course the students have to be able to understand what it means also. So therein lies a question. Is a user, is an instructor, a teacher, or the students, are they considered a user? Just because they bought the code book, does that make them a user of interest? And in a sense they are. If you go to the National Electrical Code or NFPA, many of the standards organizations have to sell their books, largely because some of the revenue is being taken away by the need to make more of their documents available to the public, because so many of these documents are now being incorporated by reference into public law. So long story short, when documents are developed, you have to keep in mind that they only have meaning if they're actually being used, and they can only be used if people understand them. And so instructors and students of the labor interests are teaching the use of the documents to their membership. So they're considered a user group. Now let's look over here. The local authority having jurisdiction, they are also, not only are they an enforcement interest, but they're also a user interest. They have to buy a book. I know that here in Ann Arbor that the cost of buying the books and keeping people trained on the codes and standards is part of their mission and part of their budget. Recently in the state of Michigan, and I'll say recent within the past 3 years, there have been organizations that are saying these codes and standards are moving too quickly. They're presenting too much of a cost to local jurisdictions for simply buying them and making them usable. So we should consider that the organization applying it is considered a user. And of course, I mentioned earlier that federal agencies that are maybe not the primary mover behind why a standard is being developed, but the Department of Energy might want to be a user of a standard that's been developed specifically by the Department of Labor, OSHA, for example. So federal agencies, individual federal agencies are adopting by reference. In fact, most federal agencies are developing their own standards, but they're also being used by others. So you want a standards developed by one federal agency to be used by another. So that's what I try to convey here in this user box. Complicated enough, guys? You don't have to answer that. Okay, so now we have the producer. So you've seen me put the user and enforcement at odds. I often will use the example of the mayor and the mayor's campaign contributors wanting to build a new apartment complex, and the enforcement says, you're welcome to build an apartment complex there, but you're going to have to get the water pressure up for the fire pump. And of course, the campaign contributor to the mayor here says, well, I never expected to have another $500,000 fire pump there. But enforcement will say you can't build your building there. So very often you'll see this within municipalities. In a certain sense, this might be the community economic development group here, and this might be the enforcement that are saying, well, part of community economic development is a safe water system. So that's why I put these two opposing each other. They don't always oppose each other. As you can see, that some of enforcement is also in here. Okay, what do we have next? We have producer. Let me take us back to here. This is where Prezi helps you. So producers generally, and I'll start with manufacturer innovators because it's very difficult to work in the standard space and not remind everyone that manufacturers, insurance, and labor are able to build the cost of their standards advocacy in the price of their products. So I wanted to make a special note here that without the innovations of manufacturers, we don't get anywhere. And they are entitled to a fair profit for their research and development interests. So I want to start out by saying that the producer interests will tend to be, in our economy, very large multinationals like Eaton and Schneider and Honeywell and United Technologies and the like. They're also innovators, and so their interest is necessary for us to improve our cities over time. But of course there's also installers and contractors. Very often you'll see that labor would like to see less built on the factory floor here and more built where they can build ours. So there's always a bit of a tension. That's almost worth a separate teleconference where you'll take, say, manufactured housing. Labor would like to build that but manufacturers have come along and found ways to build it in place, build it on the factory floor, so less is built there, there's more control over quality, et cetera, et cetera. So in the producer interest, you can see, especially in the home building, that's not our industry, but you can see where the more you can get done on the factory floor, there's greater quality control, but of course labor would like to build it in place. So that's opposed to the shareholders, people who invest in manufacturers' ability to develop a product. The guy running this show here is responsible to these guys because they're expecting 2%, 10% return on their investment. So I've tried to put these opposing each other because very often you'll find that shareholders have to restrain, or they may limit the amount of R&D that's going on over here. Typically manufacturers are putting about 2 to 4% of their gross revenues into R&D, and that's fine as long as it keeps the growth trajectory, the revenue growth up trajectory, and dividend growth continues. So very often this is an important voice. Arguably, the shareholder is also a user. You can put them in there also. So that's another complicating dimension. Now finally, let's get down to where government comes in here, and it's arguable whether government should be opposed to the general interest. And this is where I will apologize for not having all the time to look into the fine points here, and that it may not be necessary here to try to get to what we need to do to get our work done. But of course getting our work done means participating. So let's get into here a little bit more. And the general interest in many standard suites are thought to be consumer advocates and architects and engineers. Are they always diametrically opposed to the government? Not generally, but in some cases they are, depending on the technology and the standards developer. Along with government is, I'll put another counterbalance here, which is regulators and lobbyists. As we understand that in our system, the government is a legitimate stakeholder. In fact, you can see that in the ANSI categories of interest, where we drilled down before in in fact, let me go back up there if I can find it. You can see the government is recognized as a, in the user category here. Let's go back here. User government, where the standards activity in question is likely to result in a standard that may become the basis for government agency procurement. An appropriate user participant is a representative of the government agency. But it's difficult to deal with how we represent this particular interest, so I've possibly taken a shortcut here. I started to say that regulators and lobbyists, and maybe this should be a separate ball here, because lobbyists very often are part of the manufacturer innovator. I could even put another little ball here and put lobbyists on there, but lobbyists, remember, are in service of an interest that is a fair stakeholder in this process. So, but very often they have to work directly with government, and there's rules how lobbyists deal with governments. I suppose in a future version of this, I'd probably put them in separate balls. But in any case, this grouping here will often be, not always at odds, or at least oppose these interests here. Also, I'd like to complicate the story more, is that very often architects and engineers are working on behalf of the user. That's an overview of this very delicate representation of what a balance of interests might be. It's not perfect. I hope to have a chance to look at this more and develop it more. Even more than that, I hope to elicit some kind of a response to this and recommendations for improving it. But that's the broad contours of what we mean in the U.S. standard system. So let's get ourselves over to some practical examples here. I'm going to move ahead to what this looks like on the ground. Any questions? Are you still listening, guys? Are you asleep? Maybe they are. They say that economics is the dismal science, and I'll argue that standardization is the dismal science within the dismal science. Okay. I'm going to give you an example of the Simon Institute. This is a relatively new organization that University of Michigan encouraged them to become ANSI accredited, because so much of what we do involves keeping our facilities clean and hygienic. So we felt that that $200 billion part of our industry needed to have a mechanism for leading practice discovery. So that element here has generated a fair amount of debate, and it looks like activity and interest and discussion, hopefully leading practice discovery. So here now is how they have defined for their particular market what their broad interest categories are. So I'll read it. Public or private organizations that have been interested in the practices associated with the standards. So their general interest could be the trade associations and the insurance companies, government agencies, custodial work. So they have modified, because they're largely a service organization, they've included insurance companies as their general interest. And of course, consultants would be in there also. Those are not necessarily architectural engineering consultants. So that's how they define their general interest. The users, organizations or individuals in the process associated with the standards, and they include facility maintenance organizations, building service contractors, etc., etc. So you can see how in their particular technology, which again this is largely labor-oriented, they define the user differently than you'll see some of the others. And a producer manufactures materials associated with standards. So because this is a labor-dominant industry, that you'll see they will be a little bit different than some others, and we're going to get to another one, and that will be ASHRAE. Now ASHRAE also has the members are selected from various interest groups to prevent dominance of any single interest, and may include persons from such groups as. So they identify themselves. They don't have a listing the way ANSI has it, but they've identified most of the stakeholders, so to say, for their standard suite. And it's a very fast-moving standard suite, by the way. What they have done here, however, is that they've made some contingencies upon who shall be a member, and this is fair in the standard space that you may participate if you're an associate member, and I'm sure that the fees are nominal, but there is a fee, so in addition to the travel costs, of course, to participate in the standards process. One of the most important things, and this is our cinematic moment, and I guess we're going to get to it a little bit earlier than I normally do at the end, is that efforts to recruit materially affected and interest parties from diverse interest categories shall be ongoing and documented. This is the most important part, I think, of this whole presentation right here. There's our cinematic moment. They shall be ongoing and documented. It just turns out, because of the speed of which these documents are being developed, you can't always keep standards committees balanced, especially in the ASHRAE standard suite. But you'll see almost all of them are trying their level best to do it. And my thesis here for many years, our thesis, is that our industry is not engaged enough in this process given the economic footprint of our industry. So this is the important part of today's teleconference, is that these standards developers are doing their level best, in my opinion, to get members from our industry to participate, but there are barriers. Now, here is another way that NFPA deals with the classification of its committee members and how they attempt to establish balance. This, in a linear way, in prose, so to say, is what I was trying to get at with my diagram with the balls. I guess I'll call that my Calder balance interest diagram. What is that? It's kind of a wind chime. So in any case, you can see how they drill down for their particular fire safety technology, that this is what they define as the main stakeholders. And you can recall several teleconferences in the past where we've gone into how they're very orthodox in identifying who their interest categories are. So I think NFPA, if they're not the most balanced, they attempt to be the most balanced, and certainly they're most transparent of who is voting on their standards. Here is the International Code Council, and this is the last of the examples I think we have time for, is that they also have, because they're doing largely buildings, they're doing, they define their general interest producer and users. They regard academia as a user, and designers, research, see, now in other industries, research labs could also be a general interest or it could also be a producer. But in their area, they feel that the research labs, and very often they're the ones that are determining conformity on fenestration elements, chipboard, glass, windows, product certifiers. Sometimes product certifiers and research labs are different, sometimes they're the same. So in any case, here's their attempt to say that 33% of each committee are regulators. Now that's interesting because as you can see that in the ICC, how are you going to define regulator? Is that a federal regulator? Is that a state regulator? That's worth a separate teleconference on its own. In any case, of course, they define themselves. They call the voices, so to say, their players, and they've listed them here for our reference. So this came from one of their PowerPoint presentations about how they structure their co-development. How they structure their co-development process. It's important to know that it's not ANSI accredited, but it's one that they feel is suitable to their history and to the nature of their technology. So I thought I'd put that out there. We covered that a few teleconferences ago. So anyway, I use this diagram to represent how complicated these interests can be. We need to be in this space if we're going to fully leverage our economic footprint. And any questions, guys? I can see at least a few people are muted here. We've had a couple other people join us. I regret that for the interest of time, we're not going to be able to do some of the other things we usually do, like go through the a week's worth of standards that we've engaged in. I suppose I could sweep through a little bit on that. I'll get out of this because we use these Friday teleconferences to give us a review of what we've tried to do. So today we recognize that ASHRAE has 44 proposals that have come through. We need to respond to them within basically 5 weeks. Yesterday we dealt with eye and face protection. This is noteworthy because very quickly OSHA adopted the most recent version of this standard that had been developed by ISCA. So this is worth looking into in itself, the speed at which OSHA adopted this. So it's important because there's a lot of laboratories in our industry, and I don't think this presents a large product burden, although it could, but I think it's important to have seen how fast, possibly to its credit, that OSHA and ISCA got the new document out there. Site lighting, always an enlightening discussion, so to say. Campus lighting systems touch upon some of the safety, economy, and light pollution goals we have. Here's NF International trying to develop a new sustainability assessment criteria for services and service providers. I have to tell you, I get kind of lost in these. UL has a similar sustainability standard, so we'll see how this all fits in. Very often, you'll see these get adopted into international standards, and they become guidance documents for policymakers at the federal level in various nations. So that's kind of what we did. I think in general we did advance our safer, simpler, lower cost, longer lasting agenda. As you can see, we have nearly 1,300 views in about 7 months, so I'm fairly happy with that. Last week we had what, 3 or 4 attendees, and this week, 20 other people looked at them. So these are always continually being refined. That's why I have Mike on the call. And I guess before I hang up here, guys, I want to know if there's any other questions. I see they're both muted, and Jack doesn't have a microphone. So what I'm going to do here, folks, then is wish you all a good weekend, and then I'm going to leave you with a closing video. It's a couple minutes long, I think, that explains a little bit about the amount of regulation that we're facing, and some of it is well-meaning, of course, but it's one that were it not that it was coming at such a high rate, we could ignore. But our industry is noteworthy because we are a city within cities, and you'll see that a lot of federal legislation incorporates by reference many of the documents that we'll work on. So with that, I'm going to let you go, and we'll close with this video. I hope everyone has a good weekend, and we will see you next week. I believe next week we're going to be doing some podcasts or presentations or adaptations of the presentations that were at the ANSI spring meeting. I will be in New York next week, and I'll have a chance to interview many of the people at that meeting, and I hopefully will be able to convey some of the discussions that went on there to you all next week at this time. So thanks very much. Here is your closing video.
Lately, there's been a lot of discussion about the growth of regulation. So I just wanted to demonstrate how much federal regulation has grown since the year 1950. Now, federal regulation is captured in volumes like this, called the Code of Federal Regulations. These days, the average volume has about 750 pages in it. So let me start by showing you the quantity of regulation that we had back in the year 1950. So in 1950, we had the equivalent of 13 average-sized books. And these blocks represent the major regulatory agencies and departments that exist today but were created before 1950. For example, the Department of Labor, Department of Agriculture, and the SEC. Let's fast forward to 1970. So now we're in 1970. You can see we've got 5 times as much regulation as 1950. That's 73 of those average-sized books. We've also added 6 significant regulatory agencies, including Housing and Urban Development, the Department of Transportation, and the Environmental Protection Agency. Let's fast forward again to 1990. So now we're in the year 1990, and we have 13 times more regulation than we had in 1950. That's over 170 books. We've also added 6 more significant regulatory agencies, including the Department of Education, the Department of Energy, and Health and Human Services. Let's fast forward one more time to today. So, as of mid-2013, there were 235 volumes of regulation. That's 18 times the amount of regulation that we had in 1950. We've also added 4 more significant regulatory agencies, including Homeland Security and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. So, clearly there's a lot more regulation. Do we have any way of making sense of all this? In a new tool called Reg Data, we count up the restrictions, words like shall, must, and prohibited. There's well over 1 million restrictions in the Code of Federal Regulations. If you want to know about the consequences of that, check out this piece I recently wrote with my colleague Robert Green. We talk about the effects of regulation on jobs, economic growth, and the poor.